Part 110. Farmer's Blessed Girl. Author, Yu Yuzu. Chapter 1091. The prince, on behalf of the emperor, offered sacrifices to the heaven, and the ministers who have been persistently handing the emperor's impeachment papers to the emperor for the past few days have been quiet. Only a few courtiers persevered in handing up. But the pressure on the prince also eased a lot. Before the night fell, the Ministry of Rites finally prepared the crown prince's dress and hat. They used the emperor's old clothes. Xiu Niang dismantled a dragon claw and turned it into a dragon, and then put the clothes according to the prince's body. Take the amount and take it, and that's fine. Although it's a little bit worse, at least there is a dress to wear, right? The Ministry of Rites also felt shabby, but they felt it was not their problem. The prince didn't care about the details. He said to the princess while trying on clothes, "I don't know what the third child is doing at the moment." The crown princess glared at him angrily, patted him lightly and said, "Your Highness, calm down, don't mess with him these few days, and it's better to show a gesture in front of the father." The prince snorted coldly. The crown princess then whispered, "Even for the sake of the Queen Mother, it is not appropriate for your highness to have another conflict with his royal highness at this time." The prince fell silent, and then asked after a while, "How is your mother's body?" The princess sighed softly. The prince frowned and said, "What do the imperial physicians in the imperial hospital eat?" He paused and said, "Would you like to take Zhou Mangxuan into the palace to take a look?" The crown princess knew that the crown prince was talking about the little genius doctor who opened her brother's abdomen to treat his wounds. After thinking for a while, she said in a low voice, "When the sacrifice to heaven is over, I will mention it to the Queen Mother." The prince nodded, looking at himself blurred in the bronze mirror, the corners of his mouth curled up. "Tomorrow, I will be mad at that fellow." The princess couldn't hold back, she reached out and patted him again. During the Double Ninth Festival, Man Bao and the others also climbed up early. There are activities at Kuaza School, and they are going to climb the mountain today. Bai Erlang and the other first-level students decided to go to Mowai Garden to play Kushu Liu, and Man Bao finally decided to accompany Mr. Zhuang to climb the mountain. Bai Dalan naturally has his own place to go, so in the early morning, after breakfast, everyone dispersed. Man Bao took out his small backpack, went to the kitchen to pack a lot of hot and freshly baked pastries, and even small white steamed buns, and went to the husband's room to find a jar of chrysanthemum wine. Mr. Zhuang watched her wandering around the yard, finding various things like a hamster and stuffing them into the back basket. Finally, he habitually took his needle bag out of the medicine box and packed it up and put it at the bottom of the back basket. Then I took 2 bamboo tubes to the kitchen to fill with boiling water, ready to drink when I was going up the mountain on the road. Daji accompanied Bai Shan to climb the mountain, while Lu Gui drove the carriage and waited for Mr. Zhuang and Man Bao outside the door. Mr. Zhuang took a folding fan and followed behind Man Bao with a relaxed expression. Man Bao got into the car before he remembered and asked, "Sir, where are we going to climb the mountain?" Mr. Zhuang said with a smile, "I thought you wouldn't ask me as a teacher." It just so happened that it was the same mountain that Bai Shan and the others climbed, Qinghua Mountain. Man Bao, then why should we separate? Mr. Zhuang smiled and said, "Is it because you've been delayed for too long? Bai Shandu has been waiting for you at the door for a quarter of an hour." Man Bao felt that the problem wasn't his own. "You didn't tell me that I was going to climb Qinghua Mountain, I thought it was still Shangxian Duguan." "Suan Duguan is still a little shorter," Mr. Zhuang said with a smile. "This time we will go to a farther place. There are cliff stone carvings on Qinghua Mountain. This time I will take you to visit the Buddha." Man Bao was curious, cliff stone carvings. Mr. Zhuang nodded with a smile. "It's a reclining Buddha carved in stone, and there are some Buddhist scriptures carved in stone on the mountain. You can take a look." He raised his hand and patted her on the head lightly, and said with a smile, "Lest you study at home all day, and your brain will be dazed." Man Bao lowered his head and smiled, and asked curiously, "Does Mr. also believe in Buddhism?" After reading some Buddhist doctrines, you can watch it occasionally, but you are still young, so you don't need to study it. When you are older, it depends on your own preferences. Man Bao replied, "So this time we are going to climb the mountain. Well, Shun will lead you to a long experience. Qinghua Mountain is outside the city, which is much bigger than Suandu Temple. The most important thing is that there are no people in the four fields. No, there are usually no people in the four fields. Today is Chongyang. There are people everywhere at the foot of the mountain, but there are not many people on the mountain. Because the mountain is not short, it is quite large, and the people who really come to climb the mountain will spread out as soon as they enter the mountain, so it seems that there are not many people. On the contrary, at the foot of the mountain, there were quite a few hawkers who came to do business here, almost blocking the road. When Man Bao and the others' carriage arrived at the foot of the mountain, she took the lead to get off the carriage with the basket on her back, and then turned around to help Mr. Zhuang down. She looked at the lively crowd. "Where are Bai Shan and the others?" "Go up the mountain," Mr. Zhuang said with a smile. "Qinghua Mountain is so big and there are so many entrances, so you may not meet it, just follow the fate." Man Bao asked, "What about your friends, Mr. Chen? How about Mr. Chen and Mr. Zhang?" Mr. Zhuang also shook his head and said with a smile, "I only made an appointment to see you at the foot of Qinghua Mountain the day before yesterday, but I came to see today. There are so many people, it is difficult to find it. Maybe they may not go there in the morning, so let's go up the mountain as well. Can we meet? Let's meet." Man Bao nodded, "I also think it's good to follow fate." So the master and apprentice greeted Lu Gui before going up the mountain. Man Bao and Lu Gui said, "You can find a place to park your car, you can go and play by yourself, we will find you when we go down the mountain. If you can find it, the best; if you can't find it, you can go home by yourself in the evening." Mr. Zhuang, he said that he went up the mountain to find someone to follow the fate, but he didn't say that he also followed the fate when he went home. But Man Bao was already standing at the foot of the mountain with joy, 2 fingers pointed at the top of the mountain and shouted in high spirits, "Come on, let's go up the mountain." Mr. Zhuang shook his head and started to climb the mountain behind her. Qinghua Mountain is quite big. There are several peaks in the past. The one they climbed is neither high nor short. With the little apprentice who is here, his body is naturally better conditioned, so it's okay to climb the mountain. The two climbed for half an hour and then stopped to rest for a while. Mr. Zhuang sat on the stone that his disciple was looking for, while Man Bao was rummaging in the grass with her basket on his back, and after a while he picked up a twig. An unknown grass was dug out. She looked at the grass with joy and tore off a large leaf from a small tree beside her, then wrapped the grass with the leaves and put it in a basket. Seeing this, Mr. Zhuang shook his head. It seems that this little disciple's problem will never be corrected in this life. Man Bao felt that Mr. must not rest well for a while, so he waved with Mr. Zhuang and turned to go into the deeper woods. Keek was also very happy to scan the animals and plants nearby for her. Next update around 4 p.m. Farmer's Blessed Girl. Author, Yu Yuzu. Chapter 1092. In autumn, when many animals are about to hibernate, Man Bao accurately found a hole under the tree with the stick she sharpened. Ahem, it's so accurate, of course, because of Keek. When Man Bao opened the hole, he saw a thorn ball that had shrunk into a ball. It was obviously frightened and didn't dare to run when it rolled into a ball. Man Bao gently touched it with a stick, and said strangely, "Is this a hedgehog? It's written on the book, and the skin can be used as a medicinal material." Keek, host, we agreed to include it. "Don't worry, I won't fight with you." Man Bao looked around, and seeing that no one was paying attention, she took 2 steps forward and covered the small hole with her small body. She smiled, reached out and touched the hedgehog's thorn lightly, and it was instantly received into the system. Qi concluded it contentedly, and said, "I'll tell you when the encyclopedia's points come out." Manbao responded, moved back, and filled the hole she just poked. She glanced at the denser woods inside and moved. Qi also wanted the host to go in, but he had to remind the host, "Host, your husband called you." Manbao turned to look at Mr. Zhuang. Mr. Zhuang was standing beside him and waved at her. Manbao turned around and went out. On the way, he pulled a handful of wild chrysanthemums in full bloom in the woods. Manbao pulled a grass and tied the wild chrysanthemums into a handful, and asked Mr. Zhuang, "Sir, does it look good?" Mr. Zhuang glanced at it, nodded slightly, and said in a perfunctory manner, "It's beautiful, let's go, it's getting late." Manbao responded, took the flower stool and walked up with Mr. Zhuang. On the way, she saw some beautiful red or yellow flowers, so she picked a few and stuffed them into the bouquet of wild chrysanthemums. Perhaps because she felt monotonous, she pulled some more flowers. The grass that looks good is stuffed in, and the flowers are more beautiful. Mr. Zhuang was not surprised, but the pedestrians he met on the road looked at the flowers in Manbao's hands curiously. Flowers, either on hairpins, or in pots, or pruning branches and putting them in a bottle to enjoy, so that the flowers and grass are directly tied into a bunch, not to mention, it is really beautiful. When pedestrians saw it on the road, they also pulled the flowers off the hairpin, or pinned it to the ear or the placket of the clothes. Manbao chose a red flower with a particularly correct color for their husband and put it on his head. Mr. Zhang and the others were really tired. When they were supporting each other to take a rest by the roadside, as soon as they looked up at the top of the mountain, they saw two teachers and apprentices walking not far from them, laughing. Manbao deliberately walked over to Mr. Zhuang, stood on tiptoe and found a particularly good position for the hairpin on his head. Mr. Zhuang asked with a smile, "Would you like to give you a hairpin as a teacher?" Manbao looked around and found no particularly beautiful flowers, so he refused. Mr. Zhuang didn't care either, and he was about to continue crawling when he raised his feet, when a few breathless calls came from behind, "Old Zhuang, Mr. Zhuang." When Mr. Zhuang turned back, he saw Mr. Zhang and a group of very familiar people watching them, master and apprentice, from a distance behind him. Seeing them turn around, he immediately waved his hand and said, "Old Zhuang, stay here, call your disciple to help." Mr. Zhuang was speechless for a while, glanced behind them, and saw that behind them were four little servants who were carrying big bags and small bags, and couldn't make it at all, so he could only wave his hands and let Manbao go down to help people. Manbao tucked the flowers into Mr. Zhuang's arms, and went down with a basket on her back. She supported Mr. Zhang with one hand and Mr. Chen with the other before going up the mountain. Mr. Zhuang looked around and saw a large lawn on the side, so he simply left the road and walked to the lawn to sit down. Manbao helped the two gentlemen to the lawn, and then went to help the remaining two gentlemen. The servant behind them also sat on the lawn while panting and holding something. Manbao was also very tired, and sat down on the grass. It was really tiring to accompany his husband to climb the mountain. Mr. Zhang boasted, "Zhuang, your disciple is well received, and you are quite filial." Mr. Zhuang is not tired at the moment, he just looked at the things their little servants were carrying with some curiosity, and asked, "What did you bring?" Mr. Zhang glanced back, shook his hand and said, "Knowing that the Kuaza school will also come here to ascend this year, we have brought a lot less than in previous years." Mr. Chen nodded, "Yes, last year we brought tents and quilts up. We climbed high and looked far in the daytime, and we drank and admired the moon at night. It was a pleasure." When Manbao heard this, he was in a bad mood and asked, "Is it fun to sleep in the mountains at night?" Mr. Zhang rolled his eyes and nodded, "It's fun." Manbao was envious and began to ponder. Mr. Zhuang was afraid that she would be sleeping rough, so he changed the subject and asked, "Then what have you brought with you now?" It's nothing, just something to eat and drink. We've already climbed halfway, and we're still halfway there, right? Mr. Lu, who was on the side, felt out of breath, so he got up and greeted everyone. Let's go up early and get a good seat. The top of the mountain is so big, and if you go late, you won't be able to get a good seat. Everyone also got up. On the way, Mr. Zhang couldn't help but ask, Lazwang, didn't you say that you will meet at the foot of the mountain? Why did you climb first without waiting for us? Mr. Zhuang said, we waited, and we climbed before we waited. Look at the distance on both sides of us. We are the kung fu of our front and back feet, so you also came up directly at the foot of the mountain? Didn't you wait for me? Mr. Zhang coughed lightly, we looked for it, but we didn't find it. Thinking that we might meet on the mountain, we went up the mountain. Sure enough, we met on the mountain. Mr. Zhuang also nodded and said, this is fate. The other four gentlemen nodded, fate. The children in the mix are full of treasures. The five gentlemen climbed to the top of the mountain out of breath. Man Bao helped Mr. Zhuang to pant. Mr. Zhang and their four servants had already put down the big bags and small bags on their backs, shoulders, and arms. They circled the top of the mountain, looking for he found a quiet and flat place to put things down, unpacked and started to move. The top of Qinghua Mountain is not small, Man Bao glanced at it, and he couldn't take it all in at a glance. She helped Mr. Zhuang around a big rock to the lawn they were looking for, and saw four little servants spread out a roll, which turned out to be 2 straw mats. The straw mats were spread out on the lawn, and the four of them took out cups, saucers, copper pots, tea sets, melons and fruits from each bag. This preparation is more complete than what Grandma Lu prepared for climbing the mountain. Mr. Zhang and the others also came over, supporting each other, and sat down on the mat one after another. Seeing that Man Bao was still standing, Mr. Zhang greeted her very kindly, come, Man Bao, sit with me. Next update around 8 p.m. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Farmer's Blessed Girl. Author, Yu Yuzu. Chapter 1093. Man Bao sat down on the mat and took out the cakes and chrysanthemum wine she brought to share with them. The gentlemen sat comfortably on the mat, blowing the autumn wind, eating fresh melons and fruits, and drinking tea. Eat some snacks, it is more comfortable than the soaring ferry. After the rest, Man Bao couldn't sit still, so she strolled on the top of the mountain. She walked around, but she saw a lot of stones and stone walls with inscriptions, but she didn't see the reclining Buddha. She ran to Mr. Zhuang, Sir, where is the reclining Buddha? Before Mr. Zhuang spoke, Mr. Zhang said happily, you are here to see the reclining Buddha, then you have gone to the wrong place. Did you see the mountain that is slightly higher than us? Man Bao turned his head to see that it was the highest peak in the vicinity, so he nodded. The reclining Buddha is over there, you went to the wrong hill, ha 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 ha. Man Bao. Mr. Zhuang coughed lightly, I haven't been to Qinghua Mountain for many years, I forgot. He said, if you really want to see it, then go and see it. Man Bao stood on the edge of the mountain and stared at the opposite mountain in a daze. How did she get there? Did you fly over? Mr. Zhang gave her advice and pointed out a way to go down the mountain, see if you can see it, go down this way, there is a past road there, go past it is the halfway up the mountain, you can climb another half of the peak. Already. Man Bao's eyesight was pretty good, and there wasn't much obstruction on the side facing the mountain, except for a few trees, so she looked at it and found that something was wrong. She looked back at the tourists who had already settled in all corners of the top of the mountain, occupying their seats with mats or futons, and then looked at the crowds walking on the opposite side. She pointed and asked, why are there so many people over there? Mr. Chen smiled, because there is a reclining Buddha over there, We only have some stone carvings here, and there are many natural people. Man Bao understood, and she glanced at Mr. No wonder the husband was not in a hurry when he was at home. Bai Shan must have gone over there to see the reclining Buddha. Mr. Zhuang waved at his disciples and said with a smile, "Come and sit down, if you want to see the reclining Buddha. When there are fewer people in the afternoon, let's go from here. We should sit high at the moment and enjoy the mid-autumn scenery in the mountains." Mr. Zhang nodded in agreement. "Blow the autumn wind again." Mr. Lu and others also said, "We are all old bones, but we don't want to squeeze with you young people." Man Bao thought about it too. Thinking that it was still a long time today, he sat on the mat, glanced at the things people randomly put out, and simply rolled up his sleeves and said, "Sir, let me make tea for you." "Okay." Man Bao asked the servants to put aside all the things that had been put out, and don't put them all over the mat. She picked 3 of the prepared fruit plates and put them on the table, then picked charcoal to make a fire, and a servant took out a water bag of water for her, and said proudly, "This is the mountain spring water that I bought specially for making tea. Best." Man Bao poured the water into the urn, nodded and said, "It looks very clear, you can drink it later and see that it is sweet and not sweet." After making tea for the gentleman, everyone sat on the seats and drank tea, watching the scenery in the mountains from the top. Not only the old gentleman, but also Man Bao felt very comfortable. "When the autumn wind blows, I can't help but want to sleep." Seeing Man Bao squinting and dozing off, Mr. Zhuang patted her lightly and said with a smile, "Come and warm the wine, and we'll go see the reclining Buddha with you after we've had the wine." Man Bao, "Sir, can you still climb the mountain after drinking?" Mr. Zhang said with a smile, "You underestimate us too, and the small jar of chrysanthemum wine you brought is not enough for us to stuff our teeth." I saw it all, and the gentleman also brought 2 jars of wine. Mr. Lu and the others laughed out loud, and Mr. Zhang couldn't help coughing lightly. "That's not much. How about the 5 of us? How about you have 2 drinks too?" Man Bao hesitated. "The wine is a bit bitter." Although the chrysanthemum wine smelled quite fragrant. Man Bao turned around and went to warm the wine for them. After pouring the wine, he asked Mr. Zhuang, "Sir, when are we going to climb the mountain next time?" As soon as Mr. Zhuang heard it, he knew that the child was distressed for their old bones and did not plan to go to see the reclining Buddha again. He immediately laughed, "Soon, it will be the Queen Mother Qinkao soon, and Bai Shan and the others will also have to take a break from school. Mew, we don't have anything to do, so let's come then." Mr. Zhang immediately smiled and said, "Call us, it's lively when there are many people." Mr. Zhuang smiled. Knowing that Man Bao had given up the past, a group of old gentlemen became more indulgent and drank all the 3 jars of wine. Some people were crazy and read poems to the autumn wind. Some people were sleepy and slept on the seats. Mr. Zhuang also half leaned on the mat, supported his head with his hands, and squinted to look into the distance. Man Bao searched in the basket and found a small blanket rolled into a roll. She draped it over Mr. Zhuang's shoulders without disturbing them. She turned around and went to play by herself. She looked at the stone carvings for a while, then threw her wooden stick into the denser woods below, and began to turn the insects and weeds. Seeing that the child's back disappeared, Mr. Zhang smiled and looked back at Mr. Zhuang, who had closed his eyes and was sleeping. After reading a poem, Mr. Chen took out a cup of tea to moisten his mouth. When he turned his head and saw it, he smiled and said, "Don't tell me, this disciple that Lao Zhuang has received is really good. A child of this age can accompany our group of old immortals." After sitting for a long time, those grandchildren of my family have long been impatient. Mr. Zhang nodded slightly. "The main thing is to be thoughtful. She has been serving us for a long time." Man Bao is chatting with Keek, and the more he chats, the more he goes deeper and deeper. Man Bao saw a light blue cymbidium plant in full bloom on a steep and shady place. Man Bao was surprised and pointed at it and called out, Cymbidium. Keek said, host, you have recorded it? Man Bao, it's not this color. Keek analyzed it, weighed it, and said, host, the color of orchids can be cultivated. If you have an existing variety, even if you find orchids of different colors, the reward points will not be too many. It's not worth climbing this wall for a few hundred points. It said, the most important thing is, according to my data analysis, if you climb over, there is a 68% chance that you will fall below. Man Bao glanced down with the probe, took a step back after shaking, shook his head and said, forget it. Keek felt that the host was very sensible, but he was a little bit unconfident after being cheated by her too much, so Keek suggested, host, I have scanned it, there are no animals and plants to be recorded nearby, let's go back bar. Man Bao felt a little regretful, is it really gone? In fact, I can look for it in more detail. Also play in detail. Keek insisted, no more. Man Bao could only turn around and go back. She only returned to the top of the mountain when she heard lively voices coming from across a mountain wall. Man Bao turned around and saw someone smiling and said, Brother Chen, this is what you said. Your former classmate. Next update around 10 p.m. Farmer's Blessed Girl. Author, Yu Yuzu. Chapter 1094. As soon as Man Bao heard this, he ran over and saw another group of adults who were standing in front of their mats talking. Man Bao immediately squeezed in, stretched out the messy flowers that he had just picked, and had not had time to sort them out, and blocked in front of her husband, Sir, look at the flowers I picked, do they look good? The atmosphere that had just started stagnant for a moment, and everyone looked at Man Bao. Man Bao walked over to Mr. Zhuang, turned his head to look up and down at Chen Fulin, gave a meaningful ah and asked, Master Chen, are you here to apologize to our husband again? Chen Fulin raised his heart instantly when he saw Man Bao. He immediately smiled and said, Zhou Xiaoshen, my husband, and I had some misunderstandings before. It's not enough to apologize. It's just that we met and talked. After that, he turned around and smiled at the person who had spoken just now, Brother Jian, Brother Zhuang is indeed the classmate I mentioned, he is a fellow from Jianese like me, and he was very excited when he met old friends in a foreign land. Brother Jian glanced at Chen Fulin, he didn't say that before, but he also sensed Chen Fulin's abnormality, and nodded without saying anything. Mr. Zhang on the side said, Master Chen is also here to climb high and look far. Yeah, it's a custom to climb high in Chongyang. Mr. Zhang said with a smile, that's really unfortunate, we are planning to go down the mountain, why don't we do this, we occupy a good position, shall we let you? No, no, Chen Fulin hurriedly refused and smiled, we just came over from the mountain over there, so we just came to see the stone carvings, and we didn't plan to sit for a long time, so Mr. Zhang and Sun Mei sat there, and when we saw the stone carvings, we got to go. Mr. Zhang smiled, then Master Chen is free. Chen Fulin hurriedly took a step back and took his friends to leave, but before he took a step, he heard a shout from behind, Sir. Bai Shan led a group of teenagers hula running over, and at the end of the teenagers there were several chairs and and several people sat on them. Chen Fulin glanced back and saw a group of teenagers dressed in Kuazixu hula running over to surround Zhuang Sun. Zhuang Sun looked back and saw the sweat on Bai Shan's head, and said angrily, the autumn wind is cold, how can you make yourself sweat so much? It's time to wipe it off. Bai Shan touched his body and was about to wipe it with his sleeve. Man Bao handed him a handkerchief, and he took it and wiped his face while asking, Sir, why don't you go over there? I've been waiting for you on the mountain for a long time. I looked at the reclining Buddha 3 or 4 times and didn't see you. And Peng's hero's classmates who had already met Mr. Zhuang also greeted Mr. Zhuang with a salute, and helped Bai Shandao. We also helped to find a circle on the top of the mountain, and we didn't see the gentleman, so I guess that you didn't go up. The mountains over there. Mr. Zhuang smiled and said, it's not there. It's higher there and there are many people, so we came here. He glanced at the teenagers who were following behind him, and said with a smile, why are these people left in your Kuaza school? Bai Shan explained, some of them went down the mountain to go home, and some of them went for a walk in other places. Those of us who played better would come here to see the stone carvings. He turned his head and asked Man Bao, have you rubbed these stone carvings? Man Bao shook his head, just read it through, I don't want to be a nun, and the characters are average. Why should I rub it? Hey, isn't it good to speak? Man Bao, it's far worse than Mr. Jiang's. Mr. Jiang, who was drinking tea, was choked and spat out the tea in his mouth. Everyone lowered their heads to look at Mr. Jiang. Lu Huan and the others found Mr. Jiang and stepped forward to salute, hello, Mr. Jiang. I have long admired Mr. Jiang's name. Seeing that Chen Fulin stopped to look over there, Mr. Qian also looked back. He was a little puzzled, and frowned slightly, Brother Chen, didn't you say that your classmate has a flawed character? Why are there so many disciples of Kuazixu? Are they all around him? Chen Fulin said with a wry smile, it depends on everyone's luck. My classmate has luck and received 3 good disciples. Over there, Bai Shan also turned his head to look at him. His eyes met Chen Fulin's. He just looked at him and asked Manbao, why is he here too? Climb high, I just came from your side, didn't you see anyone just now? No, the top of the mountain over there is much wider than here, and there are so many people. It's a lot of time to find you. How can I still pay attention to him? Bai Shan asked, he didn't bully Mr. Right. I didn't have time, but I think he must have said bad things about Mr. to his friend. Man Bao also turned to look at Chen Fulin, the two sides were already a little far apart, and they deliberately lowered their voices, this everyone was still chatting around Mr. Jiang, so the voice couldn't get through at all. Chen Fulin just watched Bai Shan and Zhou Man watching him talking, and didn't know what he was talking about. He weighed in his heart for a moment, still pulled out a smile, nodded to the two of them, then turned around and left with Brother Qian. Man Bao asked, should we share with his friends what happened back then? If Chen Fulin came to you and said that the husband did something wrong to him, would you believe it? Man Bao said firmly, I don't believe it. Similarly, his friends won't believe it, Bai Shan said. Unless there is solid evidence, people will subconsciously trust the people they are close to, so let's not waste this talk. Man Bao nodded, well, if they don't believe it, it's not good for the husband, and they think it's the husband who is telling the truth. Bai Shan nodded. When Lu Huan turned around and saw the two of them whispering together, he couldn't help shouting, what are you talking about? It's nothing. As soon as Bai Shan turned around, he saw Yan Or had stepped off the chair and was standing not far behind him. He was slightly startled, and patted his chest and said, why don't you make a sound? Man Bao looked at his face and found that he was fine, so he asked, are you not familiar with them? What are you not familiar with? A classmate next to him heard it and shouted, he won a lot of things from us over there just now. Except for Bai Shan, he and Lu Xiaofo won the most things from us. That's right, it's too much to be unfamiliar with us after taking so many things from us. Man Bao asked curiously, what did you guys do? There was a lot of talk here, and Brother Qian, who had already turned away and left, also asked Chen Fulin curiously, the 3 good disciples you mentioned are the little girl with wild flowers in her hand just now. Why did I hear you call her the little genius doctor? Chen Fulin said, she is a famous little genius doctor in the capital recently. Besides, he has a disciple who is a student of Kuazixu, just the one who took the lead just now, and another who is a disciple of Taixuo. You say he is lucky. Is it good? However, those old things are more than 20 years ago. Who didn't make a few mistakes when they were young? Although he said this, Chen Fulin couldn't hold back in the end and sighed, his luck is true. Okay, I have accepted 3 good disciples, and I have come to Beijing again. See you tomorrow. Farmer's Blessed Girl. Author, Yu Yuzu. Chapter 1095. This sigh came from the bottom of my heart. Ever since I met Zhuangsun in the Mowai Garden on the Mid-Autumn Festival, Chen Fulin began to ask people to investigate him. Knowing that he lives in Changqing Lane now, and knowing that he is accompanying 2 disciples to study in Beijing. The most important thing a scholar cares about is reputation, so he began to arrange it, and slowly revealed some rumors of grievances in the past, thinking about waiting for the momentum to build up and then provoking his 2 disciples to leave him. As long as Bai Shan and Bai Erlang have brains, they will no longer recognize a person with a flawed reputation as their husband. At that time, what else does Zhuangsun have? He could only leave the capital again. Unexpectedly, just after he made the layout, the front foot found out that the relationship between their master and apprentice seemed to be very close. I am afraid it would not be easy to divide. To be honest, Chen Fulin really didn't take Zhou Man seriously at first. Although she is also a disciple of Zhuangsun, she is a female disciple, not to mention her family background is average, and she is a medical student. But Zhou Man's front foot is famous in the capital, and the back foot uses the Su family to enter and exit the Yin family and the Cheng family. The people who meet are all powerful. Even if she is only going to treat a disease, she may not have much friendship, but Chen Fulin, who has always been cautious, dare not act rashly. Unlike facing Bai Shan and Bai Cheng, he knew where scholars' weaknesses were, but facing Zhou Man, he was somewhat at a loss. He is not familiar with Ji Shitang, no, he is not familiar with all the pharmacies. This is an unfamiliar field. If you step in, you still have to do things of destruction. If you are not careful, you will be caught. He has been cautious all his life, preferring to be slow rather than bad. After all, although Zhuangsun was in the capital, he could only feel it when he swallowed it. If he was inadvertently and forced to remove it, he would probably scratch his throat, and then it would be a constant pain. Chen Fulin couldn't take this risk at the moment. Brother Qian felt Chen Fulin's absent-mindedness, so he asked with a smile, "Brother Chen is thinking about promotion." Chen Fulin immediately returned to his senses and smiled, where, did Brother Qian hear any rumors? Hey, I thought Brother Chen knew, Brother Qian said with a smile, isn't the right servant of the Ministry of Works an official? Brother Chen has enough qualifications and has been conscientious over the years. I thought it was Brother Chen who was promoted. Chen Fulin also heard the news, and even his Shangfeng talked to him. He curled the corner of his mouth and said with a smile, I am the boss of the Ministry of Housing, and I am separated from the Ministry of Industry by 1 floor. I am afraid that the Ministry of Personnel will meet. It is not always necessary to select candidates from the Ministry of Industry. Hey, the 2 bosses in the Ministry of Industry have only been in office for a few years, and they are still far behind in terms of qualifications. Isn't it normal for the 6 departments to rotate with each other? When they were far away, Daji turned around from behind a stone and went to look for them with the firewood he had just picked up. Bai Shan and the others have been playing around all day. They haven't eaten anything at all. They are very hungry. It happened that Mr. Zhang and the others brought a lot of food. The cooked ones are almost eaten. Many can be roasted directly on the fire. A group of teenagers suddenly became excited. Seeing that Daji had picked up a lot of firewood, they immediately rolled up their sleeves to make a fire for themselves. But a group of young masters, who have done this kind of work, finally Bai Shan and Man Bao set up the firewood to make a fire, and Mr. Zhang and their servants were responsible for stringing the ingredients they brought, and they were about to bake. Lu Huan took a few. He grabbed it and said, we will come by ourselves, we will come by ourselves. He also gave Yin or a bunch of them. Man Bao and his husband have eaten a lot, and now he is not hungry at all, and when he sees it, he said, "Yin, or you bake it is useless, you should eat less of this, or you should have some snacks, there are still some here. Dessert. Dim sum doesn't fill the stomach, the meat is delicious, let's eat meat." Lu Huan encouraged Yin Or, "Just eat a piece, I don't believe it will be okay." Yin Or ignored him. Although he didn't eat meat, he was still very curious to turn the wooden stick and roast it. Baked black. Everyone looked at the meat in his hand and gulped, and asked uncertainly, "Is this meat cooked?" Yin or himself are not very sure, it should be familiar. Bai Shan reached out and took it, "I'll give it a try." So he ate all the meat in front of everyone. Crowd. Bai Shan handed his meat to Lu Huan and said, "I have this string for you to eat." Then he said to Yin He, "I can eat it, and I can bake it like this." So he was very attentive and gave him a skewer of meat and let him continue to bake. "Bai Shan, you're going too far, how can you eat it all?" Bai Shan defended, "Not much, just 2 bites." Everyone was making a fuss, and Man Bao picked up his own meat and looked at it. He felt that it was okay, so he took it to honor Mr. Mr. Zhuang glanced at the half-charred meat, smiled gently and said, "I'm not hungry for the teacher, you can eat it yourself." Man Bao looked at Mr. Zhang and others. Mr. Zhang hurriedly said, "We're not hungry either, let's go eat." Man Bao took it to Bai Shan. Bai Shan was a little tangled. After a careful comparison, he found that Man Bao's meat was more charred than his. Lu Huan and the others ate their own roasted meat without disdain. He also ate Bai Shan's meat. He thought it was delicious. Anyway, he chewed it and swallowed it. After eating, he looked at the skewer that was handed to Bai Shan. Bai Shan took it before he reached out his hand. After tasting it carefully, he nodded slightly under Man Bao's gaze. Man Bao smiled contentedly. Bai Shan asked, "Man Bao, weren't you brought up by your sister-in-law?" "Yes." "Then why do you cook like your second sister-in-law?" Bai Shanjian swallowed the words that came to his lips, and turned to say, "We can't always make a fire in the future, let's learn how to cook." "I know how to cook," Man Bao said. "Isn't cooking a fire just to watch the fire? My steamed rice is delicious." "Bai Shan, learn to cook." Man Bao said, "Go learn, I will help you make a fire." Yin Or always felt that their topic was getting more and more crooked. Mr. Zhang and others who said they were going to pack up and go down the mountain to make room for others were the last ones to leave on the top of the mountain. Yin Or naturally couldn't rush. In fact, even if he went down the mountain, he sat on the pick chair after walking for a while. There were also several people in the group who chose to sit in the chairs. Man Bao and Bai Shan fell behind with the basket on their backs. Daji told them what he had just heard on the mountain. Man Bao frowned, is he about to be promoted? Bai Shan has already stroked it in his mind, and said, the document must not have come down, otherwise he would not be so humble, so there is still room for change. How to turn? Bai Shan touched his chin and said, do you remember that Duke of Yu County? Man Bao blinked, you mean his son? Bai Shan nodded and said, isn't he the servant of the Ministry of Industry? Since he is the servant of the right, then he is the servant of the left. The two looked at each other, hey. Next update around 4 p.m. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Farmer's Blessed Girl. Author, Yu Yuzu. Chapter 1096. Man Bao and Bai Shan were still thinking about how to talk to the Yushilang, but they didn't expect to see Yu Xiangong not long after entering the city gate. Today in Chongyang, many wealthy families make porridge or fat bags in the city. Of course, only the elderly can take them. Mr. Zhang and the others were sitting in the carriage, opened the car window and looked at the lively scene outside. They didn't know what they were looking at, so they pointed to one place and said, let's go get a lucky bag too. Mr. Chen laughed at him, how old are you, be careful to get people out. Look at my gray beard, who dares to chase me? After saying that, Mr. Zhuang will go together, let's go, the two of us are the oldest. If we don't go, they will be even more embarrassed to go. Mr. Zhuang smiled and got up to get off with him. Seeing that they were really going, Mr. Chen was stunned for a moment, and quickly chased after them. Man Bao and the others sat in the car behind, and when they saw the car in front had stopped, they stuck their heads out to look. Seeing that they were heading towards a group of old people, Bai Shan said, it seems that they are going to join in the fun, so they are getting lucky bags, right? The gentlemen all got off, and of course they also got off. Lu Huan said strangely, there are so many families who are making lucky bags along the way. Why don't so many families want them, but only his families? Man Bao pointed to an emblem on the flag and asked, whose emblem is that? Yen Or glanced at it and said, from the East Palace. Bai Shan said, since it's from the East Palace, let's go, let's join in the fun and see if we can get a share. Lu Huan was stunned, no, isn't this for the elderly? Bai Shan said, there are old people in my family too. Having said that, he stepped forward to line up first, and a group of teenagers followed him in a daze. The servant who gave the lucky bag glanced at the beards of Mr. Zhang and Mr. Zhuang, and gave them a lucky bag very generously. When it was Mr. Chen and Mr. Lu, they hesitated and didn't give it, but asked, I don't know how many, how about Mr. Gijan? Mr. Chen blushed, Mr. Lu was thick-skinned, pointed to Mr. Zhang and Mr. Zhuang and said, we are together. The servant said, sir, this lucky bag is for the elderly. Several gentlemen are looking at the prime of life, why don't they come back in a few years? It was Bai Shan's turn and they stepped forward. The servants saw the Kuazixu serving on them, smiled, and bowed slightly and asked, young masters and young ladies, this is Bai Shandao, I brought it for my grandmother. Man Bao, I also brought it for my parents. Yen Or smiled slightly, I brought it for my grandmother. The servants knew Lu Huan and exclaimed, Lu Xiaolang Kun. Lu Huan bit his head and said, I brought it for my grandfather. My grandfather should be old, right? The servant nodded blankly, Lu Shangsha's age is naturally here. He quickly took out a lucky bag to Lu Huan, and then without hesitation also sent it to Bai Shan, Man Bao and Yin Or one by one. The teenagers who were just here to join in the fun met, and they all stepped forward, I also came to pick it up for my grandmother. I came for my grandfather. Man Bao stared at the servant and said, this is my mother's, and what about my father's? The servant was already in a daze, and before he had time to ask Man Bao if her parents were old enough, he gave her another. Man Bao happily squeezed out with Bai Shan, and as soon as he looked up, he saw Yu Xiangong help a servant's hand tremblingly get out of a car. Looking at each other, both sides were stunned for a moment. Yuxian County's memory is good, but when he lights up the two children, he can't remember their names for a while, and only says, ah, you are the two children from the day before yesterday. The two nodded together. When the Duke of Yuxian saw them holding the lucky bag, he was happy and asked with a smile, why did you come to receive the lucky bag at such a young age? Bai Shan bowed and replied, this is for the elders in the family. The Duke of Yuxian asked with a smile, how many did you get? I got this one. Oh, Yu Xiangong was curious and asked with a smile, why did you take this one? Man Bao smiled and said, because this belongs to the East Palace, the lucky bag from other families can be omitted for the time being, but the prince's lucky bag needs to be received. The Duke of Yuxian smiled and took 2 steps forward and asked, why? Man Bao said, he is the crown prince. He was the most fortunate person in the world when he was born. If the old people received his lucky bag, they might be able to share some of his blessings. Bai Shan nodded and added, the old man who received the lucky bag will be blessed by him, and he will bring him some good fortune. The prince is the foundation of the country. Man Bao nodded, yes, there is still something wrong with the prince. Yu Xiangong looked at them in surprise, smiled and stroked his beard after a while and said, I haven't returned to the capital for a few years, but I didn't expect the children to grow up so well. I remember you said that you are brothers and sisters from the same section. Who is your husband? As they were talking, Mr. Zhuang, who had been waiting for them in the car, stuck his head out of the car window and called to them, Man Bao, how are you? Yu Xiangong turned around and followed the sound, and saw Mr. Zhuang stunned for a moment. He felt that this man had a good face and couldn't help but narrow his eyes. Mr. Zhuang also saw Yu Xiangong. He was startled for a moment and then quickly lowered the curtain. Mr. Zhang was unpacking the lucky bag. Seeing his stunned expression, he asked, What's wrong with Brother Zhuang? Mr. Zhuang returned to his senses and smiled, It's nothing. Having said that, I got up to get out of the car. Hey, Brother Zhuang. Mr. Zhuang turned his head and said, Gong Yu is here, so I don't dare to sit down. Duke Yu, Mr. Zhang lifted the curtain and looked outside, and saw the Duke of Yu County. He quickly collected the lucky bag and dragged Mr. Chen to get off the bus together. In addition, Mr. Liu and Mr. Qin, who were in the car, quickly got out of the car when they saw that there was something wrong with them. Mr. Zhuang straightened his sleeves, hurried forward, and gave a solemn bow 3 steps in front of Duke Yuxian, Meet the Duke of Yuxian. Yu Xiangong raised his hand slightly with narrowed eyes and said with a smile, Don't be too polite, please get up, you are. Bai Shan and Man Bao had stepped forward and stood next to Mr. Zhuang, calling out Sir. The Duke of Yu County smiled and said, Are you the husband of these 2 children? Mr. Zhuang glanced at the 2 children and saluted yes. The Duke of Yuxian nodded slightly, and Mr. Zhang and others also got out of the car and came to greet the Duke of Yuxian. Yuxian recognized Mr. Zhang. He pointed to a nearby tea house and said, Since we have met, let's sit down and have a cup of tea, and wait for me to get a lucky bag first. He smiled at Bai Shan and Man Bao and said, You guys are right just now. You cannot get this other person's lucky bag, but this prince's can't be denied, ha 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 ha. When the Duke of Yuxian went to collect the lucky bag, Mr. Zhuang reached out and patted the 2 children on the shoulders and asked, Have you met the Duke of Yuxian? Man Bao, I met my former son at the county government office, sir. Do you also know the county magistrate of Yu? Mr. Zhuang smiled and said, Of course I know Duke Yuxian, but Duke Yuxian may not recognize me. Next update around 8 p.m. Farmer's Blessed Girl. Author, Yu Yuzu. Chapter 1097. The Duke of Yuxian came to receive the lucky bag from the East Palace on purpose. After taking the lucky bag, the group went into the tea house to talk, but a group of teenagers were cautious in front of the adults. Ran. Lu Huan pulled Yin Or, Are you going? Yin Or shook his head, You go, I won't go. Lu Huan looked left and right, and seeing that the little friends were almost running, he hesitated for a while, but decided to stay. Mr. Zhang, Mr. Chen, and others obviously respect Yuxian Gong. When Yuxian Gong went to receive the lucky bag, they waited honestly by the side, and when he received the lucky bag, they respectfully invited people to the tea house. On the 2nd floor, when he sat down, he took a seat. He only sat on 1/3 of the stool, and his hands were placed in front of his belly just like Man Bao and the others were listening to lectures in class when they were children. Not to mention Man Bao and Bai Shan, even Yin or Lu Huan were taken aback for a while. Mr. Zhang turned his head to see them so dumbfounded, and said, Why don't you come and see Duke Yu soon? The 4 of them stepped forward in a daze, and the Duke of Yuxian smiled and waved, Don't let the children be so restrained, we have seen it before, come and come, all sit down. He looked at Mr. Zhuang with a smile, Are these 2 children your disciples? Mr. Zhuang bowed and replied, Yes. Duke Yuxian smiled and nodded, and asked, when did you teach them? Mr. Zhuang replied, it starts with enlightenment. The Duke of Yuxian was stunned, and his face was even more gentle, so they still followed you to enlighten? Okay, 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 I see you very familiar, have we met before? Mr. Zhuang paused for a while, then bowed and said, the boy came to the capital once when he was young, and he once sent a poem to the former minister of the ministry, Lord Hang, and Duke Yu was there at the time, so I met him. Yu Xiangong thought for a while before recalling, Hang? Is it Hang Liping? Mr. Zhuang bowed and said yes. The Duke of Yu County sighed, he died a long time ago. He has been dead for 11 or 12 years, right? You wrote to him, that was more than 20 years ago, right? At that time, he was also the Minister of Household Affairs. Mr. Zhuang replied yes again. But the Duke of Yu County didn't think it was right. Although his memory is good, there are so many people who post to them every year that he can't even remember the people who post to himself, let alone the people who post to his friends. How could he think that Mr. Zhuang was familiar? The Duke of Yu County watched Mr. Zhuang stroke his beard, and after a while, he asked with a smile, I don't know which poem you voted for back then, but you are dressed in white. That old boy didn't pick your essay and went back to his hometown. Mr. Zhang and the others did not speak, but they felt the atmosphere was stagnant. Man Bao opened his mouth to speak, but Bai Shan tugged at her sleeve. She looked back at him, and Bai Shan shook her head slightly at her. Mr. Zhuang has already read the poems and essays he voted for with a smile, without changing a word. Mr. Zhang and the others couldn't help but praised a good poem in their hearts, but the smile on Yu Xiangong's face gradually faded. He has always had a good memory, not to mention that he likes this poem written by Mr. Zhuang very much. He also had the feeling that his ambition was promising, so he liked it when he heard it back then. So of course you know what happened next. The Duke of Yuxian looked at Mr. Zhuang up and down, he straightened his back and lowered his head slightly to let him watch. The Duke of Yuxian turned his attention to Bai Shan and Man Bao, and seeing that they were looking at him with their round eyes with concern, he withdrew his gaze and looked at Mr. Zhuang, you have been white for so many years. Yes, Mr. Zhuang bowed to answer, and said after a pause, this kid has been a master for others, but he became a teacher after 2 years, until now. Duke Yuxian nodded slightly and asked, how many disciples have you accepted? 3. Duke Yuxian's eyes swept across Lu Huan and Yin Or. Mr. Zhuang lowered his head and didn't see his gaze, but Man Bao and Bai Shan did. They quickly explained, Mr. Yuxian, our junior brother isn't here today. He went to play with his classmates. Junior brother, Duke Yuxian looked at Man Bao and said with a smile, so, you are the senior sister? Man Bao nodded. But I think you are younger than your junior brother. Why is everyone paying attention to this? Man Bao said, but I started early. The Duke of Yu County asked Mr. Zhuang, is this little girl from your family? Mr. Zhuang quickly explained, no, this child has been studying with me since she was a child. She is very smart, so she accepted her as a disciple. Man Bao explained, Mr. opened a school in our village, and my sister-in-law was cooking in the school. I would go along with my children. I would sit on the threshold and listen to my teacher because I learned fast, so my husband would accept it. Made me a disciple. If you don't fix it, even my first book and pen, ink, paper, and inkstone were given by my husband. The Duke of Yu County understood, and asked with a smile, then why didn't your family give you a repair? My family was poor and had no money in the beginning. The family is poor. Yu Xiangong glanced at Mr. Zhuang and asked Man Bao with a smile, how many years have you been studying with your husband? Man Bao, it's 11 or 12 years. Bai Shan almost choked on his own saliva. Did you go to study when you were born? He couldn't help but glance at her. Mr. Zhuang also glared at Man Bao secretly, warning her to be more honest. Man Bao thought, it was indeed 11 or 12 years. Although she didn't remember it, Keek remembered it. It said a long time ago that she was very young, and she would sit on the threshold of the school when she was walking against the wall. The first sentence she learned was to call sir with the students in the school. Yu Xiangong looked at him and smiled, nodded slightly, stroked his beard and asked, I remember one of your classmates also wrote a good poem back then. What's his name? Mr. Zhuang smiled and said, it's been too long, the kid has forgotten it. At this moment, even Bai Shan couldn't help but want to speak, but when Mr. Zhuang glanced up, the two disciples could only bow their heads in frustration and said nothing. Yu Xiangong listened and nodded, and did not continue the topic, but drank some tea, talked to Mr. Zhang and others, and left. Mr. Zhang and the others sent Yuxi and Gong Gong out, and then straightened up. It's strange, when did Yugong return to Beijing? Didn't he return to his hometown? Mr. Chen stared at Mr. Zhuang thoughtfully. The classmate of Mr. Zhuang that Yu Xiangong said was Chen Fulin, right? As soon as the worshippers left, everyone looked at the sunset on the horizon and had no time to play, so they said goodbye and went back to their respective homes. Mr. Chen took Mr. Zhang to ride with him. Yin He also glanced at the time and said, I have to go home too. If you have anything to do, you can send someone a message to me, and if you need my help, just tell me. Man Bao and Bai Shan knew what he had guessed sensitively, nodded and watched him get into the car. Lu Huan squeezed up behind him and shouted, I'm with you. Anyway, our two families are on the way. After they all left, the three teachers and students got into Daji's carriage. Bai Shan and Man Bao were puzzled and asked, Sir, why didn't you tell the Duke of Yu County? See you tomorrow. Farmer's Blessed Girl. Author, Yu Yuzu. Chapter 1098. Mr. Zhuang looked at the two innocent children and sighed, Master knows what you are thinking, and why do you want Duke Yuxian to be a master? Bai Shan said, the Duke of Yu County looks like an upright man. Man Bao nodded, when an upright person encounters injustice, he will always complain for the victimized person, right? That's right, said Mr. Zhuang, if it were 10 years earlier, even 5 years earlier, the Duke of Yu County would not have been that old yet, and he was still in office, so the teacher would definitely not miss this opportunity. But he is so old now, and he has stepped down. It has been more than 20 years since the incident, and there is no conclusive evidence to prove your innocence as a teacher. You have all read the law books. You should know that the solution to a case is based on evidence, not speculation, Mr. Zhuang said. There are deep and shallow feelings, but there is no evidence. Yu Xiangong will not believe me just by my own words, it is too difficult and too complicated to find out, and he is too old. Mr. Zhuang sighed, so the Duke of Yu County would not necessarily take care of this matter, and, as a teacher, I don't want to trouble the Duke of Yuxian too much for this matter. Mr. Zhuang smiled and said, although the reputation is heavy, it has already passed by for me. You should also remember that you don't need to worry about this in the future. Mr. thinks this is the end of the matter, Man Bao frowned and said, but judging from what he has done these 3 times, even if Mr. is willing, I'm afraid he won't. Mr. Zhuang smiled at her and said, yes, I was thinking about it for the sake of the teacher. If he really does something, in order not to affect you, you should talk to him about whatever the teacher says. But now that you are famous, there's no need to find him. Seeing that the two children were puzzled, he smiled and said, I think that if the teacher understands him well, if he is not fully sure, he will not dare to do anything to me. He leaned against the wall of the car and said with a smile, he can be admitted to the government school, he is not stupid, but why is he still only a 5th-ranking man after working in office for more than 20 years? Sharp. Mr. Zhuang has been unhappy in his life, and he has thought a lot. The more people he has met and the more he has thought about it, he has figured out some truths by himself. Those truths, he once wanted to teach his son, but his son had some knots in his heart. He didn't want to be like his father all his life with impossible ambitions, but he was suffering in his heart. His wish is very simple, that is, his wife and children will be on the Kong head. He has no big ambitions. He just wants to live in the county town, and leave more shops and fields for the children in the future, and give his sons and daughters a good marriage. He wanted to teach his grandson, but unfortunately, his grandson's father was not very willing to let him teach, for fear that he would raise his son to be like his father. Although Zhuang Dalin never said it, he felt that his father lived a very hard life. This kind of hardship was not in food, clothing, housing, and transportation, but in his ambition. What he wanted to do, he could never do it. He didn't want his son to be like his father. Therefore, Mr. Zhuang has a lot of Taoist ideals but nowhere to teach. He usually teaches his students, but there are some things that are not suitable to be said all the time, and the time they have to study with him is limited. It was Man Bao, Bai Shan, and Bai Erlang, because they were by his side all the time, so he was able to tell them the truths he had figured out. Chen Fulin has been cautious all his life, but if he is too cautious, he will be indecisive, and he is too utilitarian and does not do things that are unprofitable. Although such a person will not have great difficulties, it is difficult to achieve success. Mr. Zhuang said to the two disciples, "You don't want to imitate him. Although I have always asked you to be cautious in your words and actions, you must not lose your spirit. In life, apart from fame, you should always insist on something else." Man Bao and Bai Shan nodded together, took note of the husband's words, and then brought back the topic that had gone astray. "So the teacher thinks that he is afraid of us, but will not harm you again." Seeing that they brought the topic back again, Mr. Zhuang could only break it up and talk to them, nodding and saying, "Yes, Bai Shan and Erlang are both scholars. He knows that scholars have the same name, and he has been operating in the capital for many years, and he has many of his own. There is a way to deal with your two junior brothers, but you are different." Mr. Zhuang smiled and said, "You are a doctor, and you are protected by Ji Shitang. He couldn't think of a way to deal with you for a while, and now you are in and out of the house of princes and nobles. Sometimes you can ruin his business for many years with a single word. Compared with him, I am a beggar with bare feet, but he is dressed in silk. You say, when the two meet, am I more afraid of him, or is he more afraid of me?" Man Bao said, "I didn't see that Mr. was afraid of him." Since meeting Chen Fulin, the expression on Mr. Zhuang's face has not changed much. He has been indifferent to it. "I am afraid that Chen Fulin is more afraid?" Man Bao couldn't help but smile. Bai Shan pondered, "But Mr. has weaknesses, but he hasn't discovered it yet." Man Bao turned his head and asked, "What is your weakness?" Bai Shan glanced at her and said, "You." Man Bao widened his eyes. "And me, and Bai Er." Mr. Zhuang smiled and nodded slightly, reached out and touched his head with a smile. "So, in the future, you have to learn the ability to be indifferent to emotions, do you know?" After that, he glanced at Man Bao and said, "Especially you." Man Bao immediately sat upright and restrained his expression. Mr. Zhuang snorted softly, "In the future, if you can deal with us calmly in front of us, your emotions and anger will not be visible, even if you have practiced this skill." Man Bao's face couldn't help showing a bitter look, a look of distress on his face. Mr. Zhuang patted her head lightly, and Man Bao could only hold his breath and shrink his face. Mr. Zhuang looked even more weird. Bai Shan, who was on the side, couldn't help laughing out loud. He couldn't hold back, and reached out and pinched the flesh on her face. Man Bao patted his hand, and Bai Shan interceded for her, "Sir, she is just like this in front of her family. When she goes out, she pretends to be like a little doctor with her chin raised. Look." Mr. Zhuang did not let her go, but said earnestly, "This is not enough, Man Bao, Not all friends in this world can be devoted to each other, and people must be vigilant. Master has suffered from this before, and I don't want you to suffer from it in the future. Man Bao said, Sir, don't worry, we are very cautious outside. Don't talk about Mr. Zhuang. Even Bai Shan looked at her in disbelief. Man Bao wanted to open his mouth to speak, but after thinking about it, he endured it. Humph, she's very good at keeping secrets. Keek has been with her for so many years and she hasn't told anyone. What Bai Shan thought was, you didn't even hide the fact that your father was with you, how can you still say that you are cautious? When the three returned home, Man Bao, Bai Shan, and other gentlemen went into the room to rest, then got together and whispered, so this is the case. Bai Shan said, listen to Mr., let's wait and see what happens. Man Bao remembered something and asked, I'm really not careful, am I very emotional? Bai Shan nodded heavily. Next update around 4 p.m. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Farmer's Blessed Girl. Author, Yu Yuzu. Chapter 1099. Man Bao carried his medicine box and entered the pharmacy with a small face. Xiao Xiao always arrived at the pharmacy a little earlier than her. He cleaned the clinic, and when he heard the sound of the carriage, he immediately greeted him and took the medicine box in Manbao's hand. On the first day of Manbao's expression management, she always felt that today's little peony was weird, but she didn't know that shopkeeper Zhengde and Dr. Ding were watching her quietly. Endured until noon, Dr. Tao finally couldn't bear it anymore and asked her, Man Bao, did something happen to you this time on Chongyang? Man Bao shook his head in confusion, nothing happened. The shopkeeper Zhengde said, Man Bao, if you encounter anything, you can tell me. Although we are not the same as the world, we still have some connections in the capital. Maybe it can be a reference for you. Man Bao, I really didn't encounter anything. Then why are you so serious? Yeah, this morning, the complexion is not the same as before, Dr. Ding said, I didn't see it and scared Xiao Xiao. Man Bao, don't you want to hide your joy and anger? She raised her head and looked at the shopkeeper Zhengde and Dr. Ding carefully. Seeing the concern on their faces, she couldn't help feeling warm in her heart, and then she touched her chin and thought. She asked Keek in her heart, Keek, what do you mean by emotion and anger? Keek, what I understand is that whether it is like or angry, it is not easy to put on the face. Host, according to the data analysis I have collected, like Mr. Zhuang, the method he uses to hide his emotions is to be indifferent, whether it is angry or not. Happy, with a faint smile on his face, or just expressionless, so that people can't see his thoughts, while the manager Zhengde, who is sitting opposite you, likes to cover up his real thoughts with a commercial smile. Man Bao, then what method is suitable for me? Keek, Han laugh. Seeing that she was staring at him in a daze, the shopkeeper Zheng waved in front of her. Seeing that she didn't respond at all, he said, it's over, it's all right here, this child must be in trouble. Man Bao returned to his senses and was about to say that he was all right, but the shopkeeper Xiao Zhang flew in from the outside with his robe in hand, and said anxiously, something has happened, Dad, something has happened. The shopkeeper Zhang said angrily, what's going on, didn't you see the doctors eating lunch? Take it slow. The shopkeeper Xiao Zhang swallowed a saliva, pointed to the outside and said, someone has come from the East Palace, and he said that he wants to take Dr. Xiao Zhou into the palace to see a doctor. Shopkeeper Zhang's eyes widened, and he quickly asked, who's here, the medicine boy beside your uncle? No, it was brought by an internal official. The person is in the lobby, Dad, this. Storekeeper Xiao Zhang pointed at Man Bao, unable to speak for a while, how could he enter the palace? But the shopkeeper Zhengde immediately came back to his senses and instructed him, "Hurry up, go get some more purses for Man Bao to bring. It's not easy for Xiao Xiao to enter the palace, why don't you follow me, Dr. Ding?" Dr. Ding hesitated and said, "I don't know which noble person to see a doctor. If it's for the prince, it's fine, but if I'm not suitable." The shopkeeper Xiao Zheng stomped his feet and said, "Oh, father, the internal official said, no need for other doctors to follow, just let Dr. Xiao Zhou. Then you go." Shopkeeper Xiao Zheng, huh? Go and change clothes with Xiao Xiao, and be a medicine boy to accompany Man Bao to the palace. Manager Zheng said in a low voice, "Look at her, this girl is very brave, this palace is comparable to the mansion of the Duke of Pai. Much deeper." Shopkeeper Xiao Zheng pointed to his nose, "Me? What are you afraid of? Your uncle is in the palace. It's better if you go in and talk a little bit. Hurry up." After the shopkeeper Zheng gave the order, he immediately turned around and went out to the lobby to greet the internal officials. Dr. Ding, Dr. Tao and the others hurriedly pulled Man Bao to warn him. Man Bao was confused and asked, "Who do you want to see a doctor?" How did they know? Not only Dr. Ding and the others didn't know, but the shopkeeper Zhengde, who went out to inquire about the news, didn't find out anything. In the end, Man Bao and Mr. Zheng got into the carriage in confusion. Daji, who was waiting outside, saw it, and followed a few steps in his carriage, only to stop the carriage after being warned by the accompanying imperial guards. After thinking about it, he turned around and drove the carriage to find Mr. Zhuang and Mrs. Liu. Man Bao and the shopkeeper Xiao Zheng sat in the carriage and looked at each other. In the carriage outside sat an internal official who Man Bao was familiar with, Eunuch Wu. Eunuch Wu pricked up his ears to listen, but did not hear any movement in the car, so he could not help but quietly glanced in through the gap. Man Bao and the shopkeeper Xiao Zheng in the car are staring at each other. In the end, it was Man Bao who couldn't help it, and said first, "Have you ever entered the palace?" Shopkeeper Xiao Zheng shook his head, how could he have that ability? Man Bao asked, "But isn't your uncle working as an imperial physician in the palace?" Shopkeeper Xiao Zheng, "Then it's impossible for me to go in there." Man Bao regretted, "I thought you were brought in by your uncle to see the world." The shopkeeper Xiao Zheng was speechless. He and his uncle lived so comfortably. They even went to the palace to meet the world when they had nothing to do. Man Bao put his hands together and sighed, "Then who are you seeing a doctor this time?" "I don't know," the shopkeeper Xiao Zheng shook his head and said, "but no matter who it is, we have to be honest when we enter the palace." Man Bao nodded, "I will be honest." The shopkeeper Xiao Zheng was half believing, but after entering the palace, the half-belief disappeared, and it all turned into doubt. When they got to the gate of the palace, they could only get out of the car, and after passing the inspection, they needed to enter on foot. Shopkeeper Xiao Zheng carried the medicine box, lowered his head and closely followed Eunuch Wu, who was walking in front. Man Bao, with both hands empty, looked at the palace curiously. In fact, she had seen the palace from a distance, but she had never entered it. She knew that the people who lived there were the most powerful and richest people in the world. The ground is neatly paved with slate, and it is particularly flat. As soon as you enter the gate, there is a large open space. On both sides of the palace wall are patrolling armored soldiers. Man Bao watched curiously, and Keek also scanned all this strangely, but it only scanned the data, and could not upload it to the encyclopedia. Keek still has some regrets. It would be cool if it was responsible for the system of collecting humanities and cast it into this world. Man Bao followed Wu Gonggong and looked around curiously. Eunuch Wu occasionally turned around to see it, and immediately whispered, "Dr. Xiaozhou, be careful, be careful." Man Bao let out an "oh," glanced at him, then folded his hands in front of his belly like him, and continued to walk with him. His eyes still couldn't help looking left and right, the main thing was that this palace was really too big. She has also been a guest at many people's homes. This is the first time she has seen such a big home, and it is worthy of being the emperor's home. Next update around 8 p.m. Farmer's Blessed Girl. Author, Yu Yuzu. Chapter 1100. Eunuch Wu carefully guided her through the many palaces. The further back, the more places the flower beds took up on both sides of the road, and there were all kinds of flower pots under the corridor. Along the way, Keek broadcasts from time to time without emotion that he has discovered cherished species, but not to mention Manbao. Even Keek knows that its host cannot go to the flower bed and squat to dig flowers and plants for it, so it's electronic. The tone wasn't excited at all. Manbao heard these voices and walked to a palace. She looked up at the plaque and read Lichhan Hall in her heart. Eunuch Wu turned sideways and was about to tell Manbao to follow, when he raised his head slightly. He saw her looking up at the plaque with a small head. He was startled, and hurriedly stepped forward and pulled her sleeve, and whispered, "Hurry up." Manbao lowered his head, and followed his example and turned his head slightly to talk to him. "Can't you just raise your head?" "No," Eunuch Wu sighed and whispered, "Dr. Zhou, don't talk much after you go in. You can answer whatever the masters ask you. By the way, Imperial Physician Zheng and others are also inside." Manbao gave an O and asked, "Who else is there besides the prince? Who am I seeing? A doctor?" When Eunuch Wu saw someone coming out, he hissed, "Don't ask so much, you'll know when you go in." Shopkeeper Xiao Zhen nodded again and again, and tugged at Manbao's sleeve. Manbao obediently followed Wu Gonggong in, and lowered his head, his hands folded in front of his belly, but his eyes couldn't help but move nimbly and looked at the ground. Entering a large hall, she could see that people on both sides were entering and exiting lightly, and she heard coughing sounds from far away. Manbao couldn't help but looked up slightly, and saw that there were only palace servants in and out of the hall, no prince and no other people who looked like nobles. She blinked and peered at the side screen. A young woman came out of it, and Manbao immediately lowered his head and lowered his eyes to stare at his toes. She saw Eunuch Wu, who was standing in front of her, float away from her sight. She lowered her head and didn't look up to see where the person was floating. Shopkeeper Xiao Zheng, who had been secretly watching Manbao, breathed a sigh of relief. The two heard Eunuch Wu talking to the young woman. "Aunt Chang, the doctor invited by His Highness has arrived." Aunt Chang looked at Manbao, smiled politely at Eunuch Wu, then stepped forward and said, "Open the medicine box and let me have a look." Shopkeeper Xiao Zheng immediately put the medicine box on the table beside him and opened it. Manbao finally raised his head at this moment and looked at Aunt Chang curiously, but did not expect that Aunt Chang, who was looking at the medicine box, did not look at the medicine box, but stared at her. The two looked at each other, and Manbao subconsciously smiled at her. Aunt Chang looked away from the medicine box expressionlessly. She checked the contents of the medicine box and nodded slightly. "Okay, let's go in." Shopkeeper Xiao Zheng hurriedly closed the medicine box and breathed a sigh of relief. Manbao followed behind Aunt Chang, and Shopkeeper Xiao Zheng immediately followed with the medicine box. After bypassing a screen in the middle, he went to the palace at the back, pushed the door open, and there were many people standing inside. Aunt Chang took them to a large screen, and asked them to wait and turn around the screen to enter. Manbao heard her and said, "Niang Niang, the doctor is here." The coughing sounded, and Manbao heard a soft voice, "It's not a serious illness, why did you invite a doctor from outside? Mother, you should take a look." Manbao heard that it was the prince's voice. She sighed faintly when she heard that voice. "Since you're here, let her come in and have a look, I also want to see what the person who rescued Sujian was like." Aunt Chang soon came out again, and said to the shopkeeper Manbao and Xiao Zheng, "The maiden announces you, come in." Manbao followed her around the screen and went in, and saw that there were more people standing inside. There was a person leaning on the bed in the middle. Man Bao only glanced at her secretly and lowered his head. Although only one glance, she also thinks she is very beautiful. Man Bao cupped his hands and gave a deep bow, but the shopkeeper Xiao Zheng, who was behind her, had already knelt down. Man Bao noticed that he was a little stunned for a while, but now she was bent over, and it was too late to kneel again. Man Bao could only pretend that he didn't see it, and bowed, "See the Empress." The queen raised her hand slightly and smiled, "No gift." Man Bao straightened up and looked at the queen, his eyes swept to the prince standing aside. On the side of the prince, there were still many young people, teenagers and beautiful girls, who were also looking at him curiously. Shopkeeper Xiao Zheng also stood up from the ground holding the medicine box, and couldn't help muttering in his heart, "You don't kneel and say it earlier." The queen knew that Zhou Man was young, but she was shocked when she saw her. She didn't expect her to be so young, so she couldn't help but waved and smiled, "You are Dr. Zhou Xiao. Come and see." Man Bao stepped forward, stood in front of the bed, and saw the queen more clearly. Seeing that she was haggard, but she couldn't hide her beauty, she couldn't help showing a sweet smile. As soon as the queen saw her smile, she couldn't help laughing, and beckoned her to step forward. "What a lovely child, cough, how old are you?" Man Bao felt that he couldn't lie to her, so he said very honestly, "I'm almost 13, and I am the birthday of the 12th lunar month." The queen laughed, "Then there are still 3 months of kung fu. You are so powerful at such a young age. Who did you learn your medical skills from?" "That's a lot. My 5th sister-in-law's grandfather, Dr. Ji, Yu Yifan, Dr. Chen, as well as shopkeeper Zhengde, Dr. Ding and Dr. Tao." The queen said softly, "I heard that you are still a Confucian disciple, right?" Man Bao hesitated for a moment and then nodded hesitantly, "I am studying Confucian classics, but I also read Taoism and legalism. If I learn their skills, I am considered their disciple." The queen smiled, coughed, and said, "So, you don't have to be too polite when you see us." The prince on the side said, "Mother, let her show you." The queen stretched out her hand and smiled at Man Bao, "This is an old problem. It has been more than 20 years, and no amount of medicine can cure it. You can take a look at it." Man Bao turned around, and the shopkeeper Xiao Zheng had already opened the medicine box and took out the pulse pillow from it. Man Bao put her hand on the pulse pillow and listened carefully to the pulse. The room became quiet, except for the queen's coughing from time to time. The emperor walked in, stopped everyone's movements, and stood below with his hands behind his back, watching Man Bao treat the empress. Man Bao didn't take his hand back, but looked at the queen's face and asked, "When was the first time Niang got sick?" The queen thought for a while and then said, "When I was 15 years old, I got sick in the rain at that time, but the disease was not cured, and the root of the disease was left behind." Man Bao asked, "Apart from coughing, is there anything else your mother feels uncomfortable?" "When I get sick, I always feel a pain in my chest, a pain in my head, and I feel lazy and don't want to move." Man Bao asked, "Is there any symptoms of being unable to breathe and chest tightness?" The queen smiled and nodded, "Yes, but occasionally, it's especially uncomfortable at night." Next update around 9 p.m.